So, as always, thank you everyone for attending today. We're always excited to take a deeper dive into some of these functions. What we're going to look at today is a really standard function for file hold. This is not something that's an unusual. It's very widely used. It's definitely out of the box, and it's just an automation tool to try to help get your metadata a bit more easily organized against your documents. So before I get into the actual demo, just a couple of words about what auto tagging is. It's also known as matter-centric filing. So if you're looking at sort of from the legal world and you're looking at tagging documents by matter numbers, as opposed to dealing with them as raw documents, this is a great way to get that information onto there. Now you can apply auto tagging to cabinets or folders. So you have a couple of different options to how to apply the auto tagging rules. They can be set by folder, owner, or higher role. So it's a very accessible function. Unlike some of the other things like auto filing, which means getting into some of the back-end settings, fairly low-level users can set these up. So just as long as you're the owner of the folder, you can set that auto tagging rule onto that folder. It applies to all the contents of the folder, so it's a limitation towards this, and that includes both existing documents and incoming documents. So unlike some of the other features that we talk about, this is one that's going to apply 100% globally to everything within that folder. So if you've got 1,000 documents into there and you apply an auto tagging rule to it, all of those rules will apply at once, which means that you may spend some time reprocessing those documents. So if you're using this on an existing structure, a little bit of caution with it's always advisable. The documents in there must be the same schema. So we can't do a mix of documents when we're using auto tagging rules because that defeats the purpose of it. What we're doing is we're defining a schema with metadata potentially onto a folder when we apply this, so we know that we have to be using the same schema. But it is worth noting that common metadata can always be configured. So if you have the same values towards those multiple documents, then we can always apply those when they come in using those auto tagging rules. Now, why use auto tagging? And it's a good question because it's not something that people, it's not used globally, and it's not a sort of a universal solution. And it's for use when location is the most important part of filings. When you're putting documents in and where they're located is the key element to your filing system, then this is where auto tagging becomes more of use. It mimics a paper filing system of folders for single matters. So unlike, we often talk about in FileHold how what you're putting into the folder isn't as important. If that's very important to your organization, you want to think in those sort of paper-based terms, then this is where auto tagging steps in because it offers you some of that functionality. It ensures a uniform schema and metadata where it may be in question. So if you're not, people are misfiling documents, so they're putting the wrong thing in the wrong place, this is a way of making sure that the schema and the metadata are being well defined by that document being added to the right area. And it functions as an opposite of auto filing. No, not 100%, it's not to say that the two of them never play well together, but they have to be used with caution together. Essentially, auto filing uses the document schema and metadata to determine the document's location. Auto tagging uses the document's location to determine the schema and metadata. So in that way, the auto filing and the auto tagging rules are kind of on the opposite ends of the spectrum from each other. They're both equally useful tools. I would say there's probably a little bit more chance for some automation when you're using auto filing rules. So it's usually why I start people off with that. But that's not to diminish what auto tagging can do. Now, let's talk about a couple of use cases for auto tagging. I'm going to be very vague about this. The first one is where an industry standard practices for file-based organizational structures. We often see this in governmental organizations. We see this in legal firms for sure. We'll also see this within some departments, like an HR department, for example, might want to use a folder per employee and then put all the information for that employee into the folder values for the auto tagging and then have that pushed down to the documents. It's also very useful for when you're importing large volumes of archives in a paper-based filing system that's being cloned and copied into FileHold. So you have an archive that's already organized, you just want to mimic whatever's there and bring it into FileHold. This is the perfect application for auto tagging because it mimics that structure through. It's also good for an application of schema-based retention policies globally set to documents. So if you know that all the documents that go into this area have to be the same retention policy, they might have the same schema, and therefore we're going to use the same information onto those documents. So now let's move on to our demo. And for today's use case, I'm going to use the scanning paper archives and replicating the existing physical filing cabinets into FileHold. So that's my model for what I'm going to be doing today. And with that, let's jump into my system. Let me just close out PowerPoint there, and we'll open up FileHold. So you can see I've got a big stack of documents here sitting inside of my inbox. So these are all documents that got scanned from my archive. So let's imagine that someone's going through that and they've pulled out one folder worth of documents and they've scanned them all discretely. So they've done individual scans for each of those documents. Now, alternatively, they could have batch scanned those into a single file, but in this case, let's just say that they're going to do that in a mass, for the information that's coming in. So the content of these documents is not important, and here's why. When we think about a physical filing system, we don't know what the contents of a folder are until we get to that. What we're going to be doing here is replicating the physical filing system with their tags. So if I look at the metadata for these, I've created one called Archive Paper Files, where I've got the storage room, cabinet name, drawer name, folder name from where they came from defined as metadata for the document. I want the year when the archive was created, and I want a departmental list of those that might be relevant towards the documents that are going into there. So some very basic information that talks about the documents but isn't ultimately looking at the content of them. In this case, I'd probably be looking at something like an optical character recognition filter or an OCR search to make the text of these searchable. Now, again, if you think about it, that's perfectly adequate for most of the time when you're replicating a paper-based filing system in FileHold. If I need to find a document, what I've done is I've eliminated the work that it takes for me to get up, leave my desk, walk to the storage area, retrieve the document by locating the filing cabinet and the drawer and the folder and flipping through them until I locate the document, taking it back to my desk, doing whatever I need to do with it, then returning back to the filing room, putting everything back in the right order and making sure everything's replaced. I've eliminated all of those steps. Because of that, just making the text searchable is actually, it gives me much more benefit. So now instead of having to potentially flip through every document that's in the folder, like I might have to here, what I'm going to do here is replace all of that with just using the OCR engine. So again, lots of application for how we're going to use this. I just want to spell out what our use case is. Now we understand that when we're dealing with a mass of documents, I could simply do Control-A and select all of these and update all of their metadata and push them in. That's great, but if I'm doing piecemeal scanning, that is, I'm doing some today and some tomorrow, and maybe a few more are going to filter through later on, people aren't doing this all at once, I might want to use an auto-tagging rule to set up against these documents. So let's do that now. So we can set up auto-tagging at two levels. The first level that we can do is using the properties of the cabinet. Now to access this, you need to be a cabinet administrator. So unlike the folder auto-tagging, this needs to be done at a high level. And here's where I can put auto-tagging onto this to make it the default auto-tag settings for all the folders in this cabinet, and then I can choose which one I want. So in this case, my archival paper files, and I could even push metadata onto this. So I could say that this one cabinet is going to be a particular cabinet, so we're going to call this Cabinet 1 because I'm not going to be creative today. That's enough metadata for what I need for these because the rest of this information is going to be filtered out from the documents. Probably that's all be from the same storage room as well. Let's go ahead and select those. So notice that I'm not obligated to choose all of these fields, only the ones that I definitely want to push down to the other contents. So I'm going to enable it, and then I'm going to make this the default auto tagging for all the folders in this cabinet so that I've got that exactly mimicked across. And then I'm going to say OK to that, and that now sets an auto tagging rule for across the board. Now I'm going to go even more granular here with the folder information. So again, we're going to go into our properties here for the folder. At this level, you would need to be a document, you need to be a folder owner, which means you need to be at least an organizer in order to have access to this. So a much lower level in the settings. So we're going to enable our auto tagging. I do have the right to override the cabinet because of my role as a system administrator. Otherwise, I'd be forced to use the auto tagging. But because it gives me the option, I'm going to choose my archival paper files, and then we're going to choose our structure. Now, the reason this has been pushed on, that I'm able to choose these, is because I haven't created a new object. If I created a new folder, my cabinet settings would come into place. But in this case, we'll choose our same ones as before, and we'll do Cabinet 1. And we're going to go a step further by giving it a drawer name. So we're going to call that Top Drawer. Again, you might say, why would you ever want to tag these things? This is just for content, so we can see what it's like to tag the information. And we're going to call this folder name case 10001. So I've got a piece of information that's onto these. The year of the archive for these, let's go ahead and make this, well, let's go back in time. We'll say this was the January of 2020, so I'm just going to use January 1st. I'm more interested in the year and the month on this one, but we'll use that. And then finally, I'll choose what department this was from. So I'll use my drop-down list over here and say this was an HR folder. So now that I've set up my auto tagging for these, I've put all the information onto this that I need to, and I'm going to say Okay, so now the auto tagging rule is in place, and you'll see over here there's a little A beside that's appeared. Just so you can see that in context, if I look at another folder, so here's another folder that I have no A on it because this is just a folder without an auto tagging rule. So anytime you see a folder with the A, you know there's an auto tagging rule onto there. And that means any document I add into this will have its metadata defined for it. So back in the inbox, if I take one of my documents and I just drag and drop it over here into the folder, it's now marked as ready to send, archival paper files, and the going to has been defined. So if I select my document and now go into edit, we'll see that all of my fields have been selected and I can't change the document schema. So if I go to save and next, the next document over here has not had an auto tagging rule put onto it, so it allows me to choose the schema. So even if I was to choose this one, so let's just, let me choose one of my test ones that I don't have to save the information on. So I've now saved that as test one. As soon as I move this over and drop it into that folder, it's going to tell me that the values are going to be overcopied or overwritten. So it's letting me know, hey, you're making a change to this. And now that I've done that, it's now got the same information. So now I can just go ahead and select all of my documents and I could drag them into there, or I could just click on Edit Destination and choose the folder and say OK. And now all those documents are marked as ready to send into the system. So I've done my mass tagging onto these all at once. Now, again, you might say, but I'm not planning on actually doing most of this, like from the inbox, there's other tools to use. No question. What this is good for is I've got a bunch of documents that I've been given, and I'm going to put this document over here and that one over there and this one in this place, and I'm going to put them into their different areas. And as I do that, the auto tagging rules are automatically applying. There's an automation to this that I could set up so that as soon as it's marked as ready to send, it immediately goes into the repository, which is a great tool for sort of optimizing your experience of getting the content into there quickly. So it's very useful for that. Overall, what this is designed to do is simplify that filing process and the metadata entry to minimize the points to it. Now, we can also use this with other tools as well. So for example, if I was to go into a watched folder, and we'll go into this one just as an example, I could say that I'm going to locate this document in my archival paper files. So that's going to be the document schema. So I've got that done. But if I choose, and then I can enter in my metadata. But maybe I didn't set that deliberately. Maybe instead I simply choose the location. If I choose an auto-tagged rule within my watched folder, then you'll see it pre-selects my archival paper files. It turns off my ability to edit that because it's been built into the auto-tagging. And then it's put my metadata onto it already. So now, when I'm scanning my documents, I can route them to a location as opposed to putting them into my folder, picking them up through my inbox. So if I was using a multifunction work center and I was sending those documents to a particular folder, they could be picked up over there and brought over into the system. So it definitely speeds up that process and makes things more efficient with my watched folders. If I change my folder location here, I'm going to change the auto-filing rules that will come into place. Once you set up an auto-filing rule onto an area, that then becomes a property. So if I was to clone this folder, so let's just clone this folder and we'll call this one folder 2 because I'm not, we're just doing things in demo here. We can see that the auto tagging rule has been put into place. And if I go into the properties for it, it's going to use all the same settings that I had before. So now I can change my names for these ones here. So the folder name for this one was going to be 10002. And then I can make that my folder names and keep working those through. So I clone and I only have to change one value. Now every document I add into there automatically has those values to it. Now you could say, what happens when you get to the next drawer? I can simply clone the drawer structure, and then everything's going to come across with it as well, including the folders. Now, I'd probably have to rename those, but that's a fairly simple thing to do. The overall goal for auto tagging is to put the information onto there that's central to the documents. Now, there are some limits to it. The biggest one is you can only have one document type per folder. So when I'm looking at the contents of a folder within the system, I'm not able to get discrete schema in there. I can only have one schema, which kind of leaves you with a choice. You can either make multiple folders, one for each of the schemas that you need, or the other option is you could always have one schema that has a lot of empty metadata fields to it, so it covers more than one document type. So maybe the first metadata field is type of document, and then you can tag them that way. And it's ultimately a question of what you want your library to look like. I personally am a fan of tighter folders and relying on search to locate my documents. But I also understand that a lot of organizations can't have that kind of policy. that they don't want to be sort of putting things into buckets. They need to see discrete folders for it. That thinking is we're sort of evolving away from that way of thinking, from that paper-based filing cabinet way of thinking. We just provide you with that filing cabinet here to mimic that structure, but it's certainly not a requirement. So you don't necessarily need to think that way. But again, if you're of an organization where they say this is absolutely important, we are not going to argue with you. We agree with you, and so we want to make sure that you have something that's super comfortable for you.